So the issue of genetic privacy has been becoming more important in debates about genetic testing. Genetic information may come from many sources, including a person's family medical history, a clinical examination, or a scientific test. This section aims to introduce what human genetic information is, how we can learn about our genetic information, and privacy concerns raised by that information. 3.51 Genetic information. Genes largely determine who we take after in our family, and usually we can see a mixture of our father and mother and someone new. Human cells have 46 chromosomes, 23 from each parent. Each chromosome is composed of a very large single deoxyribonucleic acid DNA molecule. A DNA molecule consists of two strands which wrap around each other in a twisted ladder conformation called a double helix. Each ladder rung consists of a pair of chemicals with bases, either A, adenine and T, thymine, or C, cytosine and G, guanine. There are over 3 billion of these base pairs of DNA making up the human genome. Genes are made of DNA. They code the directions for building all the proteins that make up our body function, and so these also they code for many different RNAs. So the RNAs and the proteins together, they make us who we are. So which genetic factors determine whether we are a man or a woman? Is there a man gene? No. Is it chromosome 18? No. Is it the X chromosome? No. The answer is D, Y chromosome. It determines if we're a man or a woman. Okay? The Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, Article 9, is on privacy and confidentiality. Okay, and it says the privacy of persons concerned and the confidentiality of their personal information should be respected. To the greatest extent possible, such information should not be used or disclosed for purposes other than those of which it was collected or consented to, consistent with international law, in particular international human rights law. Now, in the 1997 Universal Declaration on the Human Genome and Human Rights, the article on privacy talked about genetic privacy. But if we think about the genetic privacy, it's only one example of privacy. Actually, the privacy of the whole organism is very important. Except for identical twins, every person has a different genetic sequence. Variation of the sequence and the responses to the environmental factors account for human diversity. There are different types of genetic information. The genotype of a person is all the DNA they have. It provides details at the fundamental level of DNA or protein sequence. Phenotype is the observable outcome in terms of physical characteristics. In many cases, the phenotype is a result of the interaction between the genotype and environmental factors. For example, a body weight. Information about a person's physical features and gene-inherited diseases are part of the individual's genetic information. So question 2, think about what characters are determined by genetics and which are determined by the environment. And would you like to know your genes? And which genes would you like to know? For example, would you like to know the gene that determines the size of your nose? Okay? Or the color of your eyes? Or would you like to know the gene and the allele for risk for Alzheimer's, as we discussed before? 3.52, what does genetic testing tell us? A genetic test is a laboratory analysis of DNA, RNA, or chromosomal abnormalities that cause or are likely to cause a specific disease or condition. For example, Down syndrome. Tests can also analyze proteins or chemicals that are products of particular genes. Particular types of genetic testing can be used to identify carriers of genetic disease, screen newborn babies for disease, predict risks of disease, establish clinical diagnoses, and determine direct treatment. Prenatal testing of embryos and fetuses is also widely conducted in some countries, while in other countries it's not permitted if it's linked to abortion. Predictive testing estimates the likelihood that a healthy individual with or without a family history of a certain disease might develop that disease. For example, women who carry the mutated BRCA1 or BRCA2, the breast cancer gene, are more likely to develop breast cancer and ovarian cancer than other people. Information about a genetic predisposition can be beneficial to individuals. It can make them seek medical advice and receive therapy for the disease at an earlier stage, so they can try to avoid environmental factors. They also might be able to avoid a late-stage cancer diagnosis. However, in the case of single-cell gene disorder diseases like Huntington's disease, which has no effective treatment or is invariably fatal, some people may choose not to know the result of their tests. Moreover, a great deal of sensitive personal information can be derived from genetic testing with ethical, legal and social implications for individuals, families and others. Question 4. Can you get a genetic test in your country? And for what country? For what diseases? Question 5. Should genetic testing be performed when no treatment is available? And we can discuss the answers and reasons to this later. Should genetic testing be used for children? At what stage in life will you undergo genetic testing? What do you think are some ethical, legal and social implications of genetic testing? 3.53. Who should know your genetic information? The issue of genetic privacy has been becoming more important in debates about genetic testing. Some genetic information, such as color of our eyes and hair, is easy to see and cannot be kept secret. But other personal genetic information, such as the risk of developing a health disorder late in life, may have much more private character. People do not expect such information to be disclosed because they feel that this type of information is too personal. Who owns and controls personal genetic information? Who has a right to know the results of a genetic test? The ethical principle of privacy has set limits on who can have access to personal genetic information and how it should be used. Respect for an individual's genetic privacy requires us to be sensitive to the special role that genetic identity has come to play in our lives. The effects of a person on being informed that he or she would suffer a genetic disorder can be seriously harmful. It may change the ways of thinking of themselves and change decisions about matters such as marriage, childbearing and other lifestyle choices. Moreover, genetic information is not only about an individual, but also involves that individual's family and the community in which they live. Okay. So, do you think you own your genetic information? Does your mother or father own it? Does your child own it? Okay, because they're all related to you. If your sister needs you to do a gene test in order to get information about her, it's necessary for you to do so. These are all examples of questions. Now, right now, with the individual genome sequencing being possible for $1,000, then it's really people can do themselves. And researchers can, if they find it interesting as a research study, they can sequence someone's genome if that person agrees to. So the cost is no longer a great barrier. It means it still may make a difference. Let's say your grandmother had Huntington's disease. The grandchild has tested positive for Huntington's disease. What does it tell you about the father in between? Does he have Huntington's disease or not? Well, the answer is clear. Yeah? The grandmother was positive and died of Huntington's disease. The embryo or fetus is positive. Okay, has Huntington's disease. The way that you get is through your father. Let's say the father or the mother, the one who was the direct descendant of that grandparent. So even if that person didn't want to know, they now, if they know that the child is positive, they know. There are very few cases of spontaneous mutation. Very few cases. Question 8, what does privacy mean to you? What thing belongs to your definition of personal space? Do you think that privacy is individually or culturally determined? And this is a question not just for genetics, but for other things as well. Question 9. Does your school have your medical records? Who can access them? If not, where are the medical records? AUSN does not ask people to submit medical or genetic information for entry, which is just as well. But for example, in some countries it's not possible to be a medical doctor or medical student if you're colorblind. Okay? So the colorblindness test is still used in Indonesia. Until the last couple of years it was still used in Japan. It's still an issue. And I don't know in the country but you're in, if people with colorblindness are allowed to practice. And it was sort of a bit strange to me, because if, let's say you see the blood as a dark or green or blue rather than red, it's still, you can see it's a problem. But they're saying it would be a great disadvantage not to be able to see the colour red for blood. And that was their justification, to exclude people with that condition. Question 10. Do you have a right to know the results of your aunt, cousins, brothers, sisters, parents' genetic tests? Why or why not? 3.54 talks about employment and life insurance. Genetic testing not only has the potential to improve the diagnosis, prevention and treatment of diseases, but it can also reveal details of the person's current health as well as information about their susceptibility to disease. It also opens up the possibility of identifying a group of people who may be regarded as socially undesirable, perhaps leading to prejudice or discrimination. An important question facing us is to what extent, if any, genetic traits, conditions or predispositions could provide a basis for determining access to certain social goods, such as employment or insurance. Okay, so we need employment, we need insurance. Okay. While individuals may be sure about what they do not want employers to know, employers may believe that they have a number of reasons why they should know about medical and genetic information likely to affect the health and performance of employees. Employers have a legitimate interest in ensuring that an employee will be able to perform the requirements of a job, especially with regard to safety issues. An employee with a susceptibility to a genetic disorder has the potential to productivity losses and costs associated with the disease. Employers also have a potential legal liability for injuries to employees. And you can see the movie guide for the film Gattaca, which illustrates how genetic testing does not determine a person's ability to contribute to a company, because there may be many other factors and many other contributions than just one. The use of genetic information by employers raises a number of ethical issues for workers, such as issues of privacy and discrimination. Employees may also be concerned about discrimination by third parties, such as other employers, if the genetic information is disclosed to them. We should ask whether employers have a right to ask applicants to take a test as a condition of employment. Quite apart from the issues of employment, individuals who are found to be at risk for some genetic disorders may find they can only get very expensive life insurance, if they can get any at all. Insurers may attempt to use genetic information as a condition of insurance and insurability. This is because certain kinds of genetic information may reveal significant information about a person's future health. Insurers may ask applicants to disclose genetic information derived from a genetic test or a family medical history. So question 11, are the results of genetic tests different to what people can determine from your family history of disease? Question 12, would you take a genetic test if your family member asked you to? What about your school asked you to? Or an employer or insurer asked you? Who has the rights to know the results of your test? Now, you have a picture here of Amsterdam, of a canal in the book. You may have heard of the diary of Anne Frank. Anne Frank's diary. It's a famous story of a Dutch girl who tried to hide from the Nazi soldiers coming to take her. Do you know the father of Anne Frank applied to immigrate to the United States in the 1930s and was refused? Okay, he was refused. So we could actually, it was kind of interesting in his writings. His letters are now publicly published. And the U.S. immigration refused his application for entry to the U.S. He applied because he was afraid, as a Jew, of living in Holland. And the story of Anne Frank would not have happened, if the U.S. had admitted him. They fortunately did admit some Jews, but quotas had been applied. And these eugenic quotas were set in 1924 in the immigration law, with the Charles Davenport and others in the Eugenics Institute at Cold Spring Harbor, which I talked about. Cold Spring Harbor is the center of much of the genetics research still today, but its history is in the eugenics movement. They set the immigration quotas, and unfortunately he was on an overrepresented group. The quota was applied, he does not enter. So that's an interesting question of fate. So we don't know how our fate will determine our future. Now, of course, the selective killing of Jewish people, of Slavic people, of black people, of people, gypsies, other people, because of their family history. So this is an example of what happens if your information is shared and that information is used for discrimination. So that's can be extremely serious. Next page, question 13. Are individuals entitled to keep exclusive information about their genes? Is an insurance company entitled to know what risk they are taking before insuring an applicant? So the use of genetic information in employment and insurance has raised a number of ethical and social considerations. The ethical principle of justice would support promotion of equal opportunity for persons, and the ethical principle of avoiding harm would try to protect health and safety. In insurance, respecting individual decisions not to undergo genetic testing can be an injustice for others who may need to pay a higher premium. We will wish to promote individuals' autonomy in a society. However, the interests of others should also be taken into consideration. The completion of the first mapping of the human genome has provided a huge potential for research into the ways in which genes relate to people's lives. There is enthusiastic public support for promises of better medical diagnosis and treatments. However, there is also fear about new advances in biotechnology, genetic screening, stem cell research, leading to a lack of privacy and increased possibilities for genetic discrimination. The issue of informed consent is fundamental to conducting genetic research and protecting people. We have yet to make an adequate effort to resolve the ethical and social issues involved in this screening and genetic testing. A father's discovery that he carries a gene for Huntington's disease will also mean learning that his children will have a 50% chance of developing the same disease. This crucial disclosure of information has particular implications for individuals as members of families. While individuals may be ambivalent about knowing their own genetic predisposition, concern for the interests of others requires us to respect their autonomy, that is, their right to know or not to know. It's very important for this privacy to be respected, because this information can also lead to genetic discrimination. Biological samples such as blood, saliva, and amniotic fluid can be used for testing. The techniques used in your local area could be investigated by contacting local hospitals. So you could determine this. So for what purposes should other persons or third parties use this information? So that is the end of the chapter on genetic privacy. I want to go to just look at several articles in the Universal Declaration on the Human Genome and Human Rights. Now this is in section 9, and you can see this section 9 is on page 194. Okay, so the Universal Declaration of the Human Genome and Human Rights was an international consensus statement to look at the declaration, and this was has a preamble which I won't read through at the moment. I want to go to the some of the articles on page, in the article A under Human Dignity and Human Genome. Number 1, the human genome underlies the fundamental unity of all members of the human family, as well as a recognition of inherent dignity and diversity. In a symbolic sense, it's a heritage of humanity. Okay, so even though we all have the same genome, and we know I'm a human being, so in a sense, I know that much. And whether or not we like it or not, the basic human genome sequence is public, it's available. The basic human genome sequence of many tribes is public and known. So whichever group I came from, that's been made public, the genetic diseases. So certain degree of genetic information is already public domain. Now I may choose not to read about genetics, but other people will. So other people, for example, will say, okay, well, this is the Odom people, and this is the local Indian reservation people, the Odom people, the Salt River Pima Maricopa people, where AUSN is located at the moment. Odom people have the highest risk of diabetes in the world, of any population group known. That's public knowledge. So already, if somebody says tribal ethnicity, there's a strong percentage chance. So what happens for insurance? That's why it's very important that there's now any pre-existing condition or whatever genetic issue, history you come from, is not taken into account. Your insurance rate is the same in the United States. Now that could change with a different policy, but I think it's going to be very difficult to take it back from people after having given it to people. But for many years there was a discussion while there was differential insurance rates of the genetic privacy. So saying, well, and people in the United States and some other countries where they had private insurance for health were excluded from health just because they were in a family with a history of breast cancer. And the insurance company, the health insurance company, was trying to save money by saying, we will not insure you because you're going to get sick and that you're going to increase the costs of a premium. We're only going to insure people who we know don't have a history of genetic breast cancer. And then they even tried to introduce the use of gene testing. There was a period where if somebody had done a gene test, if they lied about it in the insurance, it was the same as lying about other information, and they could be excluded from coverage if they had had a test and somebody could prove it. So it was actually better for those people in the old system not to have any genetic test done, because if they had a genetic test done, when the insurance company asked you, have you had a genetic test done? And they said no, and when in fact they had, they were lying. Then for a period, these insurance companies did their own genetic tests. What happens now is that life insurance companies still can test. Now, you can argue, and it has been argued, that for a certain level of life insurance, a kind of reasonable level, everyone should have a fairness to be able to get life insurance. But if it's a particularly high life insurance policy, let's say for $1 million or more, which may nowadays not be so high if the cost of living are taken into account in some expensive countries. For those high policies, life insurance companies are allowed to do a certain battery of tests. Now, so these are issues. So we have these articles. Article 2A, everyone has a right to respect for their dignity and rights regardless of their genetic characteristics. So whether or not I have a Huntington's disease, cystic fibrosis, Down syndrome, I have a right to respect. B, that dignity makes it imperative not to reduce individuals to their genetic characteristics and to respect their uniqueness and diversity. So here it's trying not to have what's called genetic determinism, that I determine you because of the genes that you are. Now I can have different forms of determinism. I can determine you by saying, you grew up in California, you're going to be this type of person. You are French to the core, therefore you're going to be like this. Okay? Or you're from Japan, you're very fussy, you're going to be very fussy about cleanliness. Okay? Or you're from Thailand, you love chilies, so I'm going to give you more chilies when you come to the restaurant, even though some people who are Thai don't like chilies either. Okay, so this is a determinism can take many forms. It's basically based on some information I determine what I'm going to behave to you. I'm going to so dignity, human dignity, or genetic dignity means we shouldn't reduce people. It also means, of course, we can't reduce people to their gender, of course. Article 3, the human genome, which by its nature evolves, is subject to mutations. It contains potentialities that are expressed differently according to each individual's natural and social environment, including the individual's state of health, living conditions, nutrition, and education. So we talked about mutation. The mutation rate is quite high. It's clear that people do mutate. This was actually, the second part of this was included by the disability rights advocates. People have different potentiality. You can't label people just because they're disabled with muscular dystrophy to say that they are disabled people. You need to have the people of different potential. In the next page, under 5C, the right of each individual to determine whether or not to be informed of the results of genetic examination and the resulting consequences should be respected. So this is here the privacy, the right to know or not to know. And it was clearly so how do we articulate that? It means even though the whole genome sequence is known, even though many ethnic groups' genome sequence is known, even though certain physical features of your parents, your grandparents, the history of what happened is known, do you have a right not to know? And the answer is yes, you do have a right not to know. But actually, if we take that now to a right to be informed, let's say another topic which we will discuss in another chapter is reproduction. Let's say I have a history for many generations of a genetic disease. Do I have a right not to know when I'm going to have going to make a baby? That I can just say, I don't know, and I don't want to know. I don't want to do testing, even though you had a history of genetic disease over your family history. So this raises a number of questions of responsibility. If you know you have responsibility, you may still choose the same action, but do you have more liability because you took the test? But if we have that existing knowledge and that culture now, then you certainly have liability. If you had a family history of a particular genetic disorder and you reproduce, you should know what's going to happen. And we find this with certain communities where we have a lot of inbreeding, where you have particular religious groups, consanguineous marriages, they'll breed inside their group. And some of these have particular genetic disorders which are quite known. But some of these groups may be quite opposed to technology. So what's the responsibility of these groups? So these are the sorts of questions asked. I'll go back to the chapter on genetic privacy. And we have a lot of questions there. So I think I would like to open it for discussion. This chapter is just as relevant now as it was when it was written. Although health insurance in the United States has been fixed, and in many countries it's universal, in many other countries it's not. Private health insurers and private health insurance is available in some developing countries. Should such insurers use genetic tests to keep costs down for the people? And should those private health insurance groups for private medicine in developing countries, should they only insure healthy people? Because once they accept sick people, the cost for everyone will go up. And they can say, okay, well, you can get your health insurance for the public, but this is an elite club of apparently healthy people who are going to get private health insurance, and we're going to give them a favor by keeping the costs down, by trying to screen out. So that's a real question. The laws in some countries will prohibit that by saying, if they implement the UNESCO declarations, to say there's no discrimination. But if they don't, it's a kind of an open and free market. So I'd like to open for discussion.